I'll call you Professor for now, at least for the introduction.
Okay.
Thank you. I do appreciate it. So I'll go ahead and start the interview. It is nice to meet you, Professor Painter. I will confess that I do a lot of interviews, and this is one of the first I've done. This is the first I've done this year where I'm a little, where do I begin? And I'll just be honest with you. I found your book on accident, and I looked at it and said, "Oh, this will be interesting," and oh, it's kind of short. I should be able to rip right through this. And then I got about 3 pages in, and I said, "Uh-oh, where's my highlighters?" This is a textbook, isn't it?
Well, it is a book of history, of a historiography in a sense, kind of a case study of how to do and not do history, I guess.
That seems to be what it is. When I read the book, and the book is The New Atheist Denial of History. The publisher is Palgrave Macmillan, and I'd be curious to know, for starters, you are a historian, a quite distinguished one, it appears. What got you interested, sir, in the entire New Atheist movement in the first place, if I could ask?
Well, it began, I am an Episcopal priest, and I'm interested in theological issues, obviously, and so on. And I had spotted Sam Harris's book in our local library and eventually read it. And then subsequently Dawkins and Hitchens came out. I read those. And as I try to explain in the book, what really offended me was the bad history. History that I would give an F to an undergraduate for doing. It was sloppy. It was not well documented. And so I decided to begin to write about it. As an historian, I was invited to give some talks locally, both to academic and non-academic audiences. And at that time, back in 2007, 8, 9, what became known as the New Atheist was kind of taking off with particularly these 3 bestsellers. So it was at that time a somewhat hot topic, and I was at that point retired. So I had some time to work on it, and which I enjoyed. It was a good historical exercise for me.
What was it now? Okay, I'm a little almost surprised to hear that, because to be honest, and I'm not neutral, obviously you might note from the name, our project is Escaping Atheism, and I find reading all of these people painful. Both from a theological perspective, from a logic perspective, and from a history perspective. And I've often been at wit's end trying to find, like, how do you begin untangling the crazed, I'll be very opinionated, the crazed, tangled mess of strange historical. When you read Dawkins, when you read Hitchens, when you read Harris, it's like historical assertions come flying out of nowhere. And as soon as you want to grab them and examine them, they're galloping off to something else.
Well, I agree, and it bothered me that reviews of these books, even those that weren't overly favorable, had very little to say about the history, which to me was glaring. In other words, a lot of their argument is a moral argument. In other words, religion does bad things, therefore it must be wrong, which isn't terribly logical, but it's an historical moral argument. They claim that they are people of reason and that they base their conclusions on evidence. Well, I found that was not true when they did history. In other words, I thought this was a vulnerable point of theirs because they were not looking at historical evidence in any way. They were what I call ideologically driven history. In other words, they had a bunch of conclusions, religion is bad, etc., and then they cherry-picked things that they thought would support that. And that's not good. That's not history at all. It's ideology, and so that really made me angry as an historian. And got me going. And when I looked more carefully into their sources, a lot of them were very dated. Some of them were by second-rate historians or second-rate historical works, out-of-date historical works. Also, some of them were picked up on web pages from people who weren't historians at all.
You know what?
So I'd look at a
Go ahead. I didn't want to interrupt. But when we say them, right now, it appears that the primary focus of the work, you mostly address Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, and Richard Dawkins. I noticed Daniel Dennett's name is missing from your target list. Would I assume correctly that that's because he doesn't talk much about history, or?
That's exactly right. He has very little to say about history. There were a few others like Victor Stenger, who wrote a book supporting the New Atheists that I also go after because he had written quite a bit and used the history quite a bit. But so it was focused on those three and a few of their allies. But Dennett doesn't get into history, so that I just didn't need to bother really with his stuff.
Okay, so I want people to hear this as it is a very good book. It's clearly written by a historian, and therefore, again, you don't just pick. It's not a light read because it's just item after item after item, claim after claim after claim made by these new atheists, specifically Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, and Christopher Hitchens. You mention a few other names, and that some of the you call them second rate. Is pseudo-historian too hard a word to use on some of these people?
Yes. For example, I remember looking at one of the footnotes that Dawkins had, and the footnote and a couple of them together, I think it was maybe about Stalin or something. And he had a couple of very well-known history books by good historians. He didn't use them particularly well. Mm-hmm. But then he would have a footnote from some guy who claimed to be a expert on Hitler. He was an amateur. He wasn't a trained historian. I looked at the stuff he had. It was all out of context. So in other words, they were very, let's say, indiscriminate in their use. They were grasping for whatever they could find to support their point of view, even though, again, if I were reading an undergraduate history paper and they quoted some of these sources, that student would be in trouble.
Like John Toland or?
Well, Toland's a good example. He was a very popular writer of history. He did some interesting work. He interviewed, when he did his book on Hitler, a lot of people who knew him, the secretaries and so forth. And his books sold very widely. But he wasn't the best historian, especially on Hitler. They're just wonderful historians and up-to-date and so on. And as I point out in the book, he was somewhat involved with the Institute of Historical Review, which is the leading Holocaust denial group. And he had written a book about claiming that the FDR was behind Pearl Harbor, the whole conspiracy theory, mm-hmm. Which is why that particular institute liked him. They liked to look at these conspiracy things. And the biggest conspiracy for them, of course, was the Holocaust. It was all its kind of Jewish plot. Mm-hmm. So Toland was one of their featured speakers one year. And in other words, this is not the man you turn to if you want to read up-to-date, serious books about Hitler and the Nazis and all of that. But Toland said some things that they liked, so they used.
Another one they appear to use a lot is an Anne Nicole Gaylor.
Yeah, well, she was involved. There are two Gaylors, a mother and daughter. They were involved with the Freedom from Religion Foundation, which is one of the leading, atheist groups. And she's no historian at all, but she would parrot these same things. For example, as I point out repeatedly in the book, they keep referring to Stalin's several months in an Orthodox seminary, mm-hmm. which everybody knows, and fine. And it's as though that's where he learned all these bad things and so on. And they never talk about his Marxist ideology, which of course is atheist in its basis and so on. So it's a bogus argument. Everybody knows Stalin. Historians know Stalin went to the seminary. They're not hiding that. But you also have to look at the mainstream here of Lenin and Marxist ideology and lots of other things.
Wouldn't you also have
to?
Wouldn't you just also have to? I hate to interrupt. Wouldn't you also have to establish that the fact that he was in a seminary somehow directly influenced things he thought?
Sure. And you can speculate. I mean, historians talk about that a bit, but that's not the focus. I mean, it just goes so far. But again, it's an example of bad history where you pick something out while you ignore other things. Often what you pick out you don't even put into any context, and you throw it out as though it proves a point that you already established you want to prove. So you're going around in circles, I think.
I can't disagree, so I'm not neutral, but I'd like to see someone dispute you.
Well, I would have loved to have a debate with some of these people, but I guess there was no way that was going to happen. The only minor one I had is that I published an article before the book came out on this subject, fairly short article, but it hit some of the main points, and it was in it's no longer published, but a nice little historical journal by professional historians called Historically Speaking, and it prompted a letter from a man named Richard Carrier, who's one of the atheist proponents. He's also someone who's big on the subject of denying that Jesus ever existed. So he wrote this letter saying what a bad article this was. So the editor invited me to respond in writing, which I did. It was easy because Carrier's letter was just kind of silly. It misquoted me and just missed the whole thing. So that was kind of fun, but otherwise I haven't engaged with any of these people, and if they've seen my book, they I'm sure probably just want to ignore it.
Well, you make your points very well. It's a devastatingly good book. It's almost dizzying to read just because, well, you're doing what a historian does, which is documenting your sources and documenting what you're talking about, and so you wind up with this. It is a little hard to keep up with sometimes, but it matters for anybody.
Well, yeah, I know it's pretty academic, and it gets into a lot of history. What I was trying to do was contrast their history with what I call mainstream history, and the analogy I would make, it's something like a ball field, let's say a football field, and within the boundaries. The players in this case are historians. So they all have to play by the same rules. But they may not agree, or they are competitive, they have different interpretations, and historians love to argue, and it goes on and on and on. But they're playing within the boundaries of historical training that we've all been through. So we're playing by the rules. I liken the history these people produce as being out of bounds. They're out somewhere else. They're not playing by the rules. They don't know them or care for them. Again, they're looking for stuff that will support what the conclusions they've already drawn. And that's not what historians do. That's not what we're trained to do.
That's a damning indictment, and it's hard to disagree with. And the book is exceptional, and I think required reading. You'll see relatively respectable names in history right next to strange people. You have relatively respectable names that they will reference. Like there was a reference somebody, Tatiana Chimichenko, who I think has done some decent history, but they've misquoted her.
Well, that was another thing I found with that particular book and one or two others. And that book her book was a monograph on a very specialized study, professional historian, and so on. So when I got a copy and went through it, I realized that they had misrepresented the book. The book did not support some of the statements that were made, and I found that with several books. Nowhere do I, nor would I claim that this is even some self-conscious deceit on their part. I think it comes from ignorance based on this cherry picking. They see something on chapter 2, they think of a book that supports them, and so then they start quoting the book. You look at the book more carefully, and I found in several instances the book was saying exactly the opposite of what they claimed. So you couldn't trust their judgment. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, and I have found the same in my own readings, nowhere near as extensive as yours.
Mm-hmm.
But a claim will just come out about the Pope from one of these folks about the Pope being friendly with Hitler, and I'm like, wait a minute. And that's just one example, right? But that assertion gets made, and then they gallop off. And it's kind of inserted in your head. Oh, the Pope is Hitler's friend. What? No, it's not that easy. It's never that simple.
Well, exactly. They tend to reduce things rather simplistically to the point that they want to use, for their own purposes.
You do use some strong words in terms of at least the big three: Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, and Christopher Hitchens. I pulled out a couple of quotes here. You accuse Hitchens in particular of marshalling and manufacturing evidence. Of all three of the men I just named, you say they show little evidence of reading history, and probably one of your strongest statements right out of Chapter 1, there's no excuse comes to mind justifying the new atheist misuse of history. Now that's bruising words. I'm not gonna argue with you.
No, you're right. I meant them to be. I mean, this was a polemical book. But again, I was trying to base it on the standards of professional history,
which apparently they don't seem to have many of. That's the take-home message I'm getting from you. You seem to be wanting to be nice to these folks, but you say their contempt for religion brings them to contempt for history as well. They write history that makes no sense. They have, in short, gone beyond the boundaries of good historical practice. Let me ask you, when going over your book, you've got 5 basic sections here. The 20th century, you kind of work backwards, which is
exactly
cool reading. You got the 20th century. Then you've got a section on the period in Europe from 1600 to 1900. Then Europe up to 1600. Another chapter on history out of bounds and what you consider what's at stake. Let me do this, if it's okay. For each of those sections, I'm going to ask you to just make a few comments on the 20th century. What did you find questionable or worse than questionable in reading Harris, Dawkins, Hitchens, and their sources?
Well, I began with the 20th century because it first of all, most people have some general acquaintance with it. Also, their errors, I think, were the most egregious in the 20th century because they were dealing with these huge movements of communism in Soviet Russia and Nazi Germany and so on. And what I found, I'm reading about history in a way that I've never read before. I mean, that's a clumsy way to put it. But I know this stuff. I've taught this stuff. And I did not expect them to do research as professional historians. What is reasonable to expect from people who are not historians but are writing about history is that they get some good history books and do some homework, which they clearly hadn't done. So for example, in the treatment of Soviet Russia, they basically deny the persecution of religion. Now, you can debate the role of the Orthodox Church in Russia, its role with the Tsar. I'm not happy with what some of the Orthodox Church is doing today in the new Putin's Russia. But that's beside the point. There was a massive state-run, as you know, campaign for atheism, the destruction of churches, the murder of nuns and believers. And this story is in any textbook you want to read on the subject, and yet they were basically covering it up.
They covered up the specific murder of priests, nuns, monks, and others.
Well, they dismissed it. They tried to say it didn't happen. But again, an undergraduate doing a short paper on Soviet Russia, I mean, you read historians, it doesn't matter we don't even know whether these historians are Christians or atheists or whatever, but they're historians, and the facts are the facts, and there they are. And the same with the treatment of Nazism. They made a big deal of the fact that Hitler was not an atheist, which is true. He had some sense of he was some agent of divine providence and all the rest of it and so on. But again, and at some point, they almost try to make him into a Catholic since he was born a Catholic and so on. Well, again, you just don't find this when you read major biographies and studies of Hitler and Nazi Germany.
Well, he had a hatred for Christianity. He developed a hatred for Christianity. His whole regime did.
Yes, and that's again, I point out some of his attitudes, again, as given in some of the leading historians of Hitler.